The fashion industry is now one of the most profitable consumer industries globally. When we think of fashion, we often envision slender, beautiful models on the runway and celebrities wearing luxurious gowns on the red carpet, vying for attention. However, a study of fashion history reveals that both nobles and commoners have made numerous missteps in their clothing choices throughout the ages. Today, I will guide you through some of the most bizarre fashion faux pas that were once wildly popular in European history but would seem utterly peculiar by today's standards. Throughout most of history, Europeans have pursued a complexion as flawless and white as pearls. However, there was a period when having blackened teeth was considered fashionable. During the Tudor dynasty, Queen Elizabeth I was an absolute trendsetter in fashion. The Queen had a particular fondness for sweets, especially sugar imported from the British colonies in the Caribbean, which intensified her sweet tooth. Since this sugar was very expensive, having sugary dishes on the table was a sign of wealth among the nobility. But in an era devoid of dental care awareness, one can imagine the condition of the teeth of those who indulged in sweets. Queen Elizabeth I's teeth quickly deteriorated due to the consumption of high-end sweets, resulting in many blackened and decayed teeth. It is said that the fearless queen was most afraid of visiting the dentist. Despite this, her irrational subjects came to view blackened teeth as a sign of affluence due to the ability to afford imported sugar. This sparked a brief fashion trend in England, where men and women intentionally blackened their teeth to demonstrate, like the Queen, that they had the means to afford sugar. Having black teeth became a symbol of wealth and status, and to flaunt their wealth, the nobility preferred to let sugar corrode their teeth rather than maintain oral hygiene. The fashion of blackened teeth was not unique to England. In Japan's Heian period, from the 8th to the 12th centuries, Japanese nobles used a mixture called kanemizu to dye their teeth black. This mixture was a paste made from iron filings and resin. In Japan at that time, besides being considered beautiful, blackened teeth were also connected to identity and status. Typically, only Japanese nobles, samurai, and geishas were entitled to dye their teeth black, making it a symbol of their social standing. Many male and female nobles began the tooth blackening process around the age of 15, with black teeth marking their transition into adulthood. The process of dyeing teeth black is known as ohaguro, and this peculiar fashion continued through the Edo period until it was prohibited in the 1870s during the Meiji Restoration as Japan embraced Western influences and modernization. Indeed, while today's women often pride themselves on having thick, lush hair and middle-aged men look for ways to prevent hair loss, a woman with thin hair would have been considered extraordinarily beautiful in 14th century Europe. Even during the Middle Ages, hair removal was not a new concept. Europeans have been familiar with hair removal techniques since the Roman era, using shells and wax to create tools for shaving body hair. In Rome, having less body hair was seen as a sign of higher social status and was symbolic of one's class. This is why the men and women depicted in ancient Roman sculptures appear so smooth-skinned. In the 14th century, women with high foreheads were considered the most beautiful. A forehead that was clear and shiny, almost like being half bald, was a symbol of status. Women with prominently high foreheads were regarded as coming from the upper class and were also seen as more attractive. On the contrary, if you had a small forehead and thick eyebrows, you would be viewed as belonging to the lower class. To achieve this effect, upper-class women went to great lengths to obtain a smooth forehead, using various razors to shave off their naturally thick hair and applying vinegar or quicklime to erode the natural hairline. They would pluck the hair from their forehead strand by strand. Moreover, this fashion trend affected eyebrows as well, ultimately leading to all eyebrows being plucked out, which became a symbol of beauty. Another bizarre fashion of the Middle Ages was the strange and extravagant headwear worn by noble women, who prided themselves on donning large and heavy headpieces. Among these, the escoffion and the hennin were the most popular. These headpieces were made from various materials, primarily wool, and were crafted on looms, with intricate details sewn by skilled artisans. Wearers hid their hair in multiple ways under the headpiece. Hair could be braided and tucked under the headpiece or secured at the sides of the head. The escoffion favored a horizontal extension, often shaped like wide double horns, sometimes extending up to a yard long, resembling the horns of a demon as depicted in some films and TV shows. The hennin, on the other hand, was vertically oriented, shaped like a pointed cone hat, standing about 30 to 45 centimeters tall and could reach up to 80 centimeters, often complemented with a veil. The 15th century marked the peak of noblewomen's creativity with their headgear. At every court gathering, ladies would compete by wearing their most extravagant headpieces, making the scene surpass even today's costume balls in spectacle. CCO shoes, also known as poulaines, represent another peculiar fashion trend from the late Middle Ages, this time led by men. Popular from the late 14th to the late 15th century, these shoes featured an excessively long, pointed toe, which was purely decorative and not functional. They were usually stuffed with materials like cotton, moss, or horsehair to maintain their shape. At the height of their popularity, men wore these highly impractical shoes on all occasions, making activities as simple as kneeling for prayer difficult. King Charles V of France banned the wearing and production of poulaines in Paris. King Edward IV of England decreed that the toes of the shoes of nobles must not exceed 2 inches, those of merchants 1 inch, and those of peasants ½ an inch. The church also repeatedly condemned these shoes as excessively luxurious. However, like many other fashion-related edicts, these bans were largely unenforced. Even knights wore these long-toed shoes in battle. They had to cut off the tips of the shoes if they dismounted to fight on foot. During the Middle Ages, men's trousers, known as hose, were not the concept of modern men's long pants, but consisted of 2 separate tight-fitting tubes, similar to today's women's suspender stockings. At that time, there were no true underpants as we know them. Men either wore nothing under their hose, relying solely on their upper garments for coverage, or they wore a loose, baggy white cloth called braise. The 2 tubes of the hose were either tied around the waist or attached to the braise. By the end of the Middle Ages, particularly in France, the fashion trend was for shorter and shorter upper garments, which often led to exposures of the lower body due to insufficient coverage. This trend made it quite common for accidental public indecency to occur. In 1370, a monk from the Abbey of Saint Denis wrote in his diary, "I regret the recent trends. The servants' outer garments have become so short that they no longer cover their buttocks. When they bend down to serve their masters, their braise and everything inside are completely exposed." The church has strongly condemned this depraved trend at court, sternly pointing out that it is practically a blatant form of seduction and facilitates sodomy. There must be an immediate change in the length of their tunics or the creation of a new type of closed trousers. Starting from 1400, France began promoting T-shaped tight underpants, but unfortunately, these underpants were not popular among the lower classes. Soon, Italy encountered the same issue. In 1429, Father Saint Bernardino of Siena warned in his sermons that if sons' upper garments were too short to cover their buttocks, exposing too much, it was seen as encouraging sodomy. In England in 1463, King Edward IV issued an order requiring ministers to have the obligation to cover their genitals and buttocks. Eventually, this led to the birth of the next peculiar fashion trend, the Cod Piece. When discussing peculiar male fashion, one cannot overlook the Cod Piece, popular during the Renaissance era. As previously mentioned, men invented this triangular piece that attached to their clothing to cover and contain their private parts, much like a net. Initially, the primary function of the Cod Piece was indeed just to cover these essential areas. However, it wasn't long before men realized that it could also be used to emphasize the grandeur of their genitalia. Noble men designed cod pieces to complement the various fabrics of their clothes and armor, and to emphasize the impressiveness of their anatomy, they made them increasingly larger. Often, these cod pieces were erect and stuffed with various fillings. By the 1540s, the size of cod pieces reached their peak. Chopans were a type of platform shoe that was popular from the 15th to the 17th century. It's hard to imagine that these extraordinarily high shoes were in vogue for 200 to 300 years in places like Venice and Spain, especially without the surviving physical examples. Some of these shoes appear manageable to wear, while others are virtually indistinguishable from stilts. Legend has it that the inventors of these shoes were the high-end courtesans of Venice, or at least they were the ones who popularized this style into a fashionable trend. These courtesans were generally well-educated, many coming from minor nobility or the middle class. They were officially licensed by the Venetian authorities, allowing them to socialize and entertain clients in high society, making them the foremothers of courtesans across Europe. Contrary to the stereotype, courtesans did not wear frivolous or revealing clothes. Their everyday attire was similar to that of noblewomen, albeit more fashionable. To showcase their social status, courtesans favored wearing chopans when going out. The ruff collar is one of the most iconic elements of European historical dress, originating in the mid-16th century and becoming widespread across Europe by the early 17th century. Initially, the ruff was just a small V-shaped frill at the neckline, but it became increasingly exaggerated over time. The ruff reached its peak in the early 17th century in places like the Netherlands and Germany, where its diameter could extend to 20 to 30 centimeters, with frills numbering between 200 to 300 and even up to 560 frills in some found in Germany. This stiff, detachable collar, rather than merely being an accessory, could be likened to a collar that enforced social distancing around one's neck. The width of some ruffs makes one wonder how their wearers managed to eat while wearing them. Speaking of maintaining social distance, we must mention another historical European fashion accessory that was once all the rage: the pannier. Note that pannier is not a casual term, but rather the actual term for a type of hoop skirt that was popular during the Rococo period of the 18th century, an essential component of courtly women's attire. Paniers, as the name suggests, are primarily worn by women under their skirts as a fashion accessory designed to shape the external outline of the skirt. Throughout European history, various forms of panniers have been popular, as women have always been fascinated with altering the silhouette of their dresses. Examples include the wide crinoline panniers and the bustle panniers that accentuated a raised posterior. When panniers first emerged during the Rococo period, they were initially just simple hoop skirts shaped like brick slabs. However, their excessive horizontal expansion led them to become one of the most peculiar fashions in history by the mid-18th century, especially in British court dress. The width of these skirts could reach 2 to 3 meters, making them the widest style of women's clothing historically. One existing piece of court dress worn by a Scottish lady reached a width of 3 meters, marking it as the widest skirt in Britain and likely unmatched worldwide. Wearing such a skirt meant that no one could be within a 1.5 meter radius around the wearer, as a simple turn could easily knock someone over. These skirts could only be worn freely in the spacious doorways and staircases of palaces. Getting stuck in an ordinary house was almost a certainty with such attire. It may look like a regular 18th century women's skirt, but the emerald green dye used on this garment contained a deadly component. In Victorian-era Britain, this dye produced garments of a vibrant green color that made the wearer stand out like a gemstone in a crowd. Before the invention of arsenic dye, dyeing fabric green was notoriously difficult for manufacturers. Achieving a green color directly on fabric required multiple layers of overdyeing and often resulted in unsatisfactory outcomes, which is why green garments were rare. Arsenic dye, which combines arsenic trioxide with copper, was cheap and plentiful, capable of producing an exceptionally vivid green. However, arsenic is a poison, and prolonged exposure to it could be deadly. Arsenic dyes were used in the production of clothing, shoes, gloves, artificial flowers, and wreaths. People who came into contact with these dyes suffered severe burns and ulcers where the fabric touched their skin, and hair loss could occur. Prolonged exposure was potentially lethal. In 1861, a 19-year-old girl named Matilda Scheurer died from arsenic poisoning. At the time of her death, she vomited green liquid, and both her nails and the whites of her eyes turned green, a terrifying sight. An autopsy revealed fatal levels of arsenic in her organs, accumulated from her job of dyeing artificial flowers with green arsenic dye. If you happen to possess any green antique clothing from between 1775 and 1920, handle it with care. These beautiful green embroideries are actually the wings of jewel beetles, a technique that originated in 18th century India. During the Victorian era, ladies attending balls would wear lightweight cotton gowns adorned with thousands of beetle wings, which shimmered like emeralds. These wings symbolized their wealth, power, and aesthetic sense. Typically, the number of beetle wings used determined the garment's costliness. Records from 1898 indicate that a single dress could be embroidered with up to 5,000 beetle wings. If the use of dead jewel beetle wings is somewhat acceptable to you, the 1890s American trend of turning live insects into jewelry accessories would definitely make you cringe. At that time, there was a fashion trend in the US that mixed pet and animal-themed jewelry. Live lizards were sold to women as chameleons, which would change color to match the wearer's outfit, providing coordinated jewelry for every garment. Women embraced this idea, placing these small creatures in tiny collars attached to little chains that could be pinned to brooches, scarves, or even worn in the wearer's hair. After the intervention of animal cruelty prevention societies, New York issued a citywide ordinance prohibiting the sale of lizards. However, this did not stop the trend. In the 1920s, a young woman wore a chameleon hair clip to a dance. Because her dance partner's head was too close, the chameleon accidentally fell into the man's mouth.